At the heart of this tragic tale were three individuals whose lives became inextricably intertwined in a web of forbidden desire and deadly consequences. Sydney Peters, a 68-year-old retired librarian with a penchant for romance novels, had always yearned for excitement beyond the pages of her books. Her husband, Reginald Peters, a 70-year-old former high school principal, was a pillar of the community, known for his strict moral code and unwavering principles. The catalyst for the unfolding drama was Tom Crawford, Reginald's 20-year-old son from a previous marriage. A brooding artist with soulful eyes and a troubled past, Tom had recently moved into the Peters household, bringing with him an air of youthful rebellion that would soon ignite a passionate and ill-fated affair. As the crisp autumn air settled over Ashford, no one could have predicted the storm that was about to engulf the Peters family. What began as a seemingly innocent connection between a stepmother and her adult stepson would spiral into an obsession that defied societal norms and familial bonds. Sydney Peters was born in 1956 in a small town in upstate New York. The only child of a seamstress mother and an absent father, Sydney learned early on to find solace in the world of books. Her childhood was marked by loneliness and a yearning for the kind of romance and adventure she read about in her beloved novels. As a young woman, Sydney pursued a degree in library science, driven by her passion for literature and her desire to surround herself with stories. It was during her college years that she first married, a whirlwind romance with a charismatic philosophy student named Xavier. The marriage was short-lived, ending after just 2 years when Xavier's wanderlust led him to abandon Sydney for a spiritual journey in India. Heartbroken but resilient, Sydney threw herself into her career, eventually becoming the head librarian in her hometown. Her second marriage, to a local accountant named Gerald, lasted longer but was marked by a growing sense of dissatisfaction. Gerald was kind but unimaginative, and Sydney found herself increasingly drawn to the passionate tales in her romance novels, longing for the kind of all-consuming love she had never experienced. It was in her late 50s, newly divorced and feeling that life had passed her by, that Sydney met Reginald Peters. He was everything her previous husbands were not: distinguished, intellectual, and financially secure. Reginald, a widower, seemed to offer Sydney the stability and respect she craved, and she was flattered by his attention. Their courtship was brief, but intense, and within 6 months Sydney found herself relocating to Ashford as Mrs. Peters. The move represented a fresh start, a chance to reinvent herself in a new community. Sydney threw herself into the role of the principal's wife, joining local book clubs and volunteering at community events. Yet, as the years passed, a familiar restlessness began to creep in. Reginald, for all his virtues, was set in his ways and showed little interest in the passion and spontaneity Sydney craved. She found herself spending more time alone in their house, retreating into her books and secret fantasies. It was into this simmering discontent that Tom arrived, bringing with him a youthful energy that stirred something long dormant in Sydney's heart. Little did she know that her step-grandson's presence would awaken desires that would lead them all down a path of no return. Tom Crawford came into the world on a stormy night in 2004, the product of Reginald Peters' brief second marriage to Lydia Crawford, an art teacher 20 years his junior. From the beginning, Tom's life was marked by conflict and upheaval. His parents' relationship was tumultuous, with Lydia's free-spirited nature clashing constantly with Reginald's rigid traditionalism. The marriage ended when Tom was just 5 years old, with Lydia gaining primary custody. She moved them to Burlington, where she pursued her artistic passions and exposed young Tom to a bohemian lifestyle that was worlds away from his father's conservative values. Weekends and holidays with Reginald became a study in contrasts, leaving Tom torn between two vastly different worlds. As he grew older, Tom began to exhibit his mother's artistic talent and rebellious spirit. His teenage years were marked by increasingly frequent clashes with authority, both at school and during his visits with Reginald. He experimented with different art forms, from graffiti to performance art, often pushing boundaries and testing limits. Tom's relationship with his biological mother, while close, was complicated by Lydia's struggles with bipolar disorder and substance abuse. There were periods of intense creativity and joy, followed by dark times when Tom found himself taking on the role of caretaker. This instability left its mark, contributing to Tom's brooding personality and his difficulty in forming lasting relationships. At 18, Tom's world was upended once again when Lydia, in the throes of a manic episode, was involved in a car accident that left her hospitalized and unable to care for herself. With his mother facing a long recovery and his own future uncertain, Tom reluctantly agreed to move in with his father and Sydney in Ashford. The transition was far from smooth. Tom, with his tattoos, moody demeanor, and avant-garde artistic sensibilities, stood out like a sore thumb in the conservative town. He clashed frequently with Reginald, who saw his son's lifestyle as a personal affront to everything he stood for. It was Sydney who first extended an olive branch, recognizing in Tom a kindred spirit, someone who, like her, felt out of place in the stifling atmosphere of Ashford. Her attempts to connect with her troubled stepson would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to tragedy. As Tom settled into life in the Peters household, neither he nor Sydney could have foreseen the dangerous attraction that was about to blossom between them, an attraction that would shatter the fragile peace of their family and the town itself. The seeds of obsession were planted on a sultry August evening, just 3 months after Tom had moved into the Peters home. Sydney, unable to sleep in the stifling heat, had wandered down to the kitchen for a glass of water. She paused in the doorway, transfixed by the sight before her. Tom stood bathed in the pale light of the open refrigerator, shirtless and glistening with a thin sheen of sweat. He was absently sketching on a napkin, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sydney felt her breath catch in her throat, suddenly acutely aware of the young man's physical presence, in a way she had never been before. Tom looked up, startled by her presence. Their eyes met, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. Sydney, flustered, mumbled an apology and retreated to her bedroom, her heart pounding with an excitement she hadn't felt in years. From that night on, Sydney found herself hyper-aware of Tom's presence in the house. She began to seek out opportunities to be near him, offering to bring him snacks while he worked on his art in the garage, or lingering in the living room when he watched late-night movies. At first, Tom seemed oblivious to the change in his stepmother's behavior, but as the weeks passed, he began to notice the way her gaze would linger on him, the slight tremor in her voice when she spoke to him. Part of him was uncomfortable with the attention, but another part, the part that had always felt starved for affection, basked in it. Sydney's obsession grew in secret, hidden behind the facade of maternal concern. She began to imagine scenarios where she and Tom might be thrown together, engineering innocent encounters that allowed her to be close to him. She volunteered to do his laundry, savoring the scent of him on his clothes. She insisted on driving him to his art classes in town, treasuring the moments of closeness in the car. As autumn approached, Sydney found herself falling deeper into fantasy. She imagined Tom as the hero of her romance novels, seeing in him the passion and danger she had always craved. In her mind, their age difference and familial connection faded away, replaced by a narrative of star-crossed lovers defying societal norms. Reginald, absorbed in his work and community obligations, remained oblivious to the changing dynamics in his home. He saw Sydney's attentions to Tom as nothing more than a stepmother trying to bond with her new stepson, and he was pleased by what he perceived as a thawing in the frosty relationship between his wife and son. But beneath the surface, tension was building. Tom, conflicted by his growing awareness of Sydney's interest, began to withdraw. He spent more time locked away in the garage, working on increasingly dark and introspective pieces of art. Sydney, interpreting his withdrawal as a challenge, only intensified her efforts to connect with him. As the leaves began to turn and a chill crept into the air, the Peters household teetered on the edge of a precipice. Sydney's obsession, fed by years of unfulfilled desires and romantic fantasies, was about to spill over into reality, setting in motion a series of events that would end in tragedy. The line between fantasy and reality blurred on a rain-soaked evening in late September. Reginald was away at a conference, leaving Sydney and Tom alone in the house. The power had gone out, plunging the old Victorian into darkness. Sydney, armed with candles, made her way to the garage where Tom had been working on a new sculpture. She found him frustrated, unable to continue his work without proper lighting. In the flickering candlelight, Sydney saw an opportunity. She suggested they pass the time with a glass of wine, an offer Tom reluctantly accepted. As they sat in the dimly lit kitchen, the storm raging outside, Sydney began to open up about her past, her unfulfilled dreams, her loneliness. Tom, perhaps softened by the wine and the intimate atmosphere, found himself sharing his own insecurities and fears. He spoke of his troubled relationship with his mother, his feelings of inadequacy in his father's eyes, his struggle to find his place in the world. Sydney listened with rapt attention, her hand occasionally brushing against his in a gesture of comfort that sent electricity through them both. As the night wore on and the wine flowed freely, the conversation took a more personal turn. Sydney, emboldened by the alcohol and the charged atmosphere, confessed her attraction to Tom. She spoke of how he had awakened feelings in her that she thought were long dead, how she saw in him the passion and artistry she had always craved in a partner. Tom, conflicted and overwhelmed, tried to resist. He spoke of the inappropriateness of the situation, of his respect for his father, but Sydney persisted, moving closer, her voice dropping to a husky whisper as she detailed the fantasies she had been harboring. In the candlelight, with the storm howling outside, the boundaries between right and wrong began to blur. Their first kiss was tentative, almost chaste, but it quickly deepened, years of pent-up desire and loneliness pouring out in a flood of passion. Sydney's hands roamed over Tom's body, marveling at his youthful firmness, so different from Reginald's aging frame. Tom, despite his initial reservations, found himself responding to Sydney's experienced touch, her confidence igniting a fire within him. They made love on the kitchen floor, surrounded by guttering candles, the storm providing a soundtrack to their illicit passion. In the aftermath, as they lay tangled together on the cold tiles, reality began to seep back in. Tom, overcome with guilt and confusion, retreated to his room without a word. Sydney, flushed with triumph and lingering desire, began to plan how to ensure this was not a one-time occurrence. The next morning brought awkwardness and averted gazes. Tom tried to apologize, to suggest they forget what had happened, but Sydney was having none of it. She cornered him in the hallway, pressing her body against his as she whispered promises of discretion and future pleasures. Tom, still reeling from the events of the previous night, found himself agreeing to continue their affair, partly out of desire and partly out of fear of the consequences if he refused. And so began a dangerous dance of secrecy and passion. Stolen moments in dark corners of the house, hurried encounters when Reginald was occupied with work or community events. Sydney blossomed under Tom's attention, feeling more alive than she had in years. She lavished gifts on him, expensive art supplies, designer clothes, justifying the expenses to Reginald as attempts to help Tom feel more at home. Tom, for his part, found himself torn between guilt and a growing emotional attachment to Sydney. She offered him the unconditional love and acceptance he had always craved, albeit in a form he had never expected. His art took on a new intensity, filled with themes of forbidden love and hidden desires. As autumn deepened into winter, their affair intensified, the risk of discovery adding a thrilling edge to their encounters. But beneath the passion, a current of unease was growing. Both Sydney and Tom knew that what they were doing could not last forever. That discovery would bring consequences neither of them was prepared to face. Yet, caught in the throes of their forbidden love, they continued on, heedless of the gathering storm. As the affair between Sydney and Tom intensified, so did the complexity of maintaining their double lives. Every day became a careful choreography of stolen glances, secret touches, and elaborate lies. The Peters house, once a symbol of respectability in Ashford, now harbored a scandal that would shock the community to its core if ever revealed. Sydney threw herself into her role as the perfect wife and stepmother with renewed vigor, perhaps compensating for her guilt. She hosted dinner parties for Reginald's colleagues, baked cookies for the church bake sale, and volunteered at the local library. To the outside world, she appeared more engaged and vibrant than ever, and many in the town remarked on her apparent renewed zest for life. Meanwhile, Tom adopted a surly, withdrawn persona in public, playing up the role of the troubled artist. This allowed him to spend long hours alone in the garage studio without arousing suspicion. His art took on a feverish quality, filled with hidden symbols of his forbidden relationship, a recurring motif of an older woman's hands, landscapes that hinted at secret, shadowy places. Their encounters became increasingly daring. A quick tryst in the laundry room while Reginald watched football in the den. Passionate embraces in the garden shed, the scent of freshly cut grass mingling with their heated breaths. Once they even made love in Reginald's study, the thrill of possible discovery adding a dangerous edge to their passion. But living a double life took its toll. Tom began to struggle with insomnia, spending long nights staring at the ceiling, torn between desire for Sydney and guilt over betraying his father. His artwork, while praised for its raw emotion, began to disturb those who viewed it, the underlying tension and conflict evident in every brushstroke. Sydney, for her part, became increasingly possessive and demanding. She would fly into quiet rages if Tom so much as spoke to a woman his own age, her jealousy all the more potent for having to be hidden. She began to take risks, leaving love notes in Tom's pockets or sending suggestive text messages at all hours of the day. The strain began to show in small ways. Tom became forgetful, once calling Sydney darling at the dinner table before catching himself. Sydney would sometimes gaze at Tom with undisguised longing, only remembering to compose herself when Reginald cleared his throat pointedly. As winter settled over Ashford, the pressure of their secret began to weigh heavily on both Sydney and Tom. They found themselves jumping at small noises, paranoid that every ring of the doorbell or unexpected visit from a neighbor would lead to their exposure. The thrill of their forbidden romance was increasingly overshadowed by the constant stress of maintaining their deception. Despite the growing tension, neither Sydney nor Tom could bring themselves to end the affair. They had become addicted to each other, to the passion and intensity of their encounters. But as the new year approached, both began to sense that their carefully constructed house of cards was on the verge of collapse. Reginald Peters had always prided himself on his powers of observation. As a former principal, he had honed the ability to detect when students were lying or hiding something. It was this keen eye that began to pick up on subtle changes in his household as the winter progressed. At first, the signs were easy to dismiss. He noticed Sydney humming to herself more often, a spring in her step that he attributed to a new book club she had joined. He observed Tom spending more time at home, which he interpreted as a positive sign that his son was finally settling into life in Ashford. But as January gave way to February, more troubling patterns emerged. Reginald began to notice hushed conversations that would abruptly cease when he entered a room. He caught Sydney and Tom exchanging long glances across the dinner table, their eyes communicating something he couldn't decipher. One evening, Reginald came home early from a school board meeting to find the house eerily quiet. As he approached the garage, he heard muffled voices and what sounded like a stifled laugh. When he opened the door, he found Sydney and Tom standing unnaturally far apart, both looking flushed and disheveled. Sydney quickly explained that she had been helping Tom with his latest art project, but Reginald couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Reginald began to pay closer attention to his wife's behavior. He noticed her taking more care with her appearance, wearing perfume even on days when she had no plans to leave the house. He found receipts for expensive lingerie hidden in her dresser drawer, items he had never seen her wear. Tom, too, began to act strangely around his father. The young man, who had always been moody but generally respectful, now seemed unable to meet Reginald's eyes. He became defensive when questioned about his daily activities, and Reginald once overheard him having a heated whispered argument with Sydney in the kitchen. As suspicion took root in Reginald's mind, he found himself lying awake at night, replaying conversations and interactions in his head. He began to question everything, from Sydney's sudden interest in Tom's art to the way the two of them always seemed to end up alone together in the house. Despite his growing unease, Reginald hesitated to confront either his wife or his son directly. Part of him didn't want to believe what he was beginning to suspect, but as winter dragged on, the tension in the Peters household continued to build, pushing inexorably towards a breaking point. The day everything came to a head began like any other. Reginald left for work early, his mind preoccupied with the mounting evidence of something amiss in his home. Sydney and Tom, believing they had the house to themselves, let their guard down. They were in the midst of a passionate encounter in the master bedroom when they heard the front door open. Reginald, having forgotten some important papers, had returned unexpectedly. In their panic to separate and dress, Sydney and Tom failed to hear Reginald's footsteps on the stairs. The bedroom door swung open, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. Reginald stood frozen in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Sydney, her blouse half-buttoned, stood by the window while Tom scrambled to pull on his jeans. The silence was deafening, broken only by Sydney's sharp intake of breath. Then, as if a dam had burst, Reginald's rage exploded. His face contorted with fury, he launched into a tirade, his voice rising to a roar that echoed through the house. "How could you?" he demanded, his words directed at both his wife and son. Sydney, recovering from her initial shock, attempted to approach Reginald, her hands outstretched in a placating gesture. She began to speak, her words a jumbled mix of apologies and excuses. She talked about loneliness, about feeling abandoned and unloved. She tried to explain the connection she felt with Tom, how he understood her in a way Reginald never had. But her words only seemed to fuel Reginald's anger. He rounded on Tom, demanding to know how long this had been going on. Tom, pale and shaking, attempted to shoulder the blame. He spoke of manipulation, of confusion, of feeling trapped. But his words rang hollow, and Reginald could see the genuine emotion in his son's eyes when he looked at Sydney. As the confrontation escalated, the room seemed to shrink, the air thick with tension and unspoken accusations. Reginald's rage, initially explosive, had cooled into something harder, more dangerous. His voice, when he spoke again, was low and controlled, but trembling with suppressed emotion. He told Sydney that their marriage was over, that he wanted her out of the house immediately. To Tom, he said that he no longer had a son, that the young man before him was dead to him. Sydney, realizing the full impact of what was happening, became hysterical. She clutched at Reginald's arm, begging him to reconsider, to give her another chance. In her desperation, she said things she knew she could never take back, cruel words designed to hurt Reginald as deeply as he had been hurt. It was at that moment, as Sydney's accusations hung in the air, that something in Reginald snapped. With a roar of inarticulate rage, he lashed out, his hand connecting with Sydney's face with a sickening crack. Sydney stumbled backward, her eyes wide with shock and fear. Tom, galvanized into action, moved to intervene, but Reginald was beyond reason. In a frenzy of violence that seemed to last both an eternity and mere seconds, Reginald's hands found Sydney's throat. Tom tried desperately to pull his father away, shouting for him to stop, but Reginald's grip was like iron. By the time he finally released Sydney, it was too late. She crumpled to the floor, her eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. The room fell silent save for Reginald's ragged breathing. Father and son stood over Sydney's motionless body, the full horror of what had just occurred slowly sinking in. In the space of a few devastating minutes, their lives had been irrevocably altered, and the peaceful facade of their existence in Ashford had been shattered beyond repair. In the immediate aftermath of Sydney's death, the Peters house was plunged into a surreal, nightmarish state. Reginald, his rage spent, sat slumped in a corner of the bedroom, his eyes vacant, muttering incoherently to himself. Tom, in shock and disbelief, paced the room, alternating between bouts of hysterical crying and frantic attempts to revive Sydney. It was Tom who finally broke the paralysis that had gripped them both. With shaking hands, he reached for his phone to call 911. As he dialed, the reality of what he was about to do hit him. He was about to turn his own father in for murder. The sleepy town of Ashford, to such violence, was soon buzzing with activity. Police cars and an ambulance, their lights painting the snow-covered street in alternating red and blue, drew curious neighbors from their homes. Reginald offered no resistance as he was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror. Tom, questioned separately, found himself struggling to piece together a coherent account of what had happened. The truth seemed too horrific, too unbelievable to put into words. As news of the tragedy spread, the tight-knit community of Ashford reacted with disbelief and sorrow. Reginald Peters, the respected former principal, arrested for the murder of his wife, Sydney, the friendly librarian who always had a kind word for everyone, dead, and young Tom, now orphaned in the most terrible way imaginable. In the days that followed, as the police investigation unfolded, more details came to light. Rumors began to circulate about the true nature of Sydney and Tom's relationship. Some defended them, arguing that love knew no boundaries. Others condemned them, seeing their actions as a betrayal of family values. The Peters house, once a symbol of respectability, now stood empty and forlorn. Yellow police tape fluttered in the winter wind, a stark reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. As winter gave way to spring, the case against Reginald Peters moved forward. His lawyer, citing temporary insanity brought on by extreme emotional distress, prepared for what promised to be a sensational trial. The prosecution, armed with Tom's reluctant testimony and physical evidence from the scene, was confident in their case. Ashford, shaken to its core by the events in the Peters house, would never be quite the same. The tragedy served as a stark reminder that even in the most idyllic of settings, darkness could lurk just beneath the surface. As the investigation into Sydney's death deepened, investigators began to piece together the complex web of events that had led to that fateful day. Interviews with neighbors, analysis of phone records, and a thorough examination of the Peters home painted a picture of a family in turmoil, their respectable facade hiding dark secrets. One of the key pieces of evidence came from Sydney's personal diary, discovered hidden in a locked drawer of her writing desk. The journal detailed the progression of her obsession with Tom, from innocent attraction to full-blown affair. The entries revealed a woman torn between guilt and desire, aware of the wrongness of her actions, but unable to stop herself. Tom's art studio in the garage proved to be another treasure trove of information. Investigators discovered a series of paintings and sketches that, while not explicitly incriminating, hinted at the illicit relationship. One particularly striking piece depicted an older woman's hands intertwined with those of a younger man, set against a background of stormy skies. Tom, still in seclusion, was portrayed alternately as a victim of manipulation and a homewrecker who had destroyed his family. His aunt fended off constant requests for interviews, issuing only a brief statement asking for privacy during this difficult time. Over the course of 2 weeks, the prosecution laid out their case, painting a picture of a man driven to violence by jealousy and betrayal. Tom, appearing gaunt and haunted, took the stand to testify against his father, his voice barely above a whisper as he recounted the events leading up to his stepmother's death. Reginald's defense team argued for a charge of manslaughter, citing the extreme emotional distress their client had been under. Character witnesses spoke of Reginald's previous good standing in the community, his dedication as an educator, his reputation as a loving husband and father. In the end, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of second-degree murder. As the judge announced the sentence, 25 years to life, a collective gasp rose from the courtroom. Reginald, his face a mask of resignation, was led away in handcuffs. Tom, unable to watch, slipped out of the courtroom, leaving behind the town that had been his home and the tragedy that had defined his young life.